Hi, everyone. Welcome to Module 8, Metaphysics, Nihilism, and Śūnyatā. Until now, we focused on the problem of metaphysics, or more specifically, the problem of religious metaphysics, from within the framework of modern Western culture. But the spread of Western culture throughout the globe, especially through colonialist projects of expansion and extraction, meant that the anxieties and dilemmas that may have begun with Western metaphysics didn't necessarily remain there. Metaphysics, after all, isn't something only thought, I should say. It's implicit in the ways that we organize ourselves, the technologies we produce, the legal and social arrangements we enact, and much else besides. Modern Japanese philosophy can be said to begin with the Meiji Restoration in the second half of the 19th century, a period marked by a rapid and intense opening to Western influence throughout Japanese thought and culture. This included philosophy, which the Japanese began to call Tetsugaku, a neologism combining the word tetsu, wisdom, with gaku, meaning learning. As a discipline, Tetsugaku began as the study of Western philosophy by Japanese thinkers and students. It was not, in the first place, an exercise in comparative methods, but all of that changed in the late 19th and early 20th century with a man named Nishida Kitaro, often considered the father of modern Japanese philosophy. Born in 1870, Nishida worked to articulate a Japanese philosophy that drew as well on the concepts, styles, and traditions of the West. Nishida's first great work to do so is entitled An Enquiry into the Good, which he published in 1911. This book is really looking for a way of answering what Nishida sees as the central question of philosophy. What is ultimate reality? His answer? Ultimate reality is pure experience. That is, experience without a self. The other way to describe this would be to speak about nothingness, what Zen calls mu. Western thought assumes that there is no experience without an experiencer, a subject of experience. But Nishida argues that this personal experience is itself a kind of abstraction or congealment of pure experience. This, to put it in terms that we've used earlier in this course, is essentially articulating or seeking to grasp the nettle of the problem of correlationism. But personal experience and the correlational problem are logically or metaphysically subsequent to prior pure experience, according to Nishida, a pure experience that cannot be represented, but can be realized, as it is in Zen. In the preface to An Inquiry into the Good, Nishida writes, "It goes without saying that there is much to admire in and much more to learn from the impressive achievements of Western culture, which thought of form as being and of the giving of form as good. However, does there not lie hidden at the base of our Eastern culture, preserved and passed down by our ancestors for several thousand years, something which sees the form of the formless and hears the voice of the voiceless? Our hearts and minds endlessly seek this something, and it is my wish to provide this quest with a philosophical foundation." Nishida's inquiry, along with his subsequent studies and his pioneering efforts to think nothingness and emptiness in terms that could engage the West, laid the groundwork for what came to be known as the Kyoto School of Philosophy, the most influential system of philosophy to emerge out of Japan in the last century. At the heart of the Kyoto School's comparative methodology is the search, on the one hand, for affinities and resonances between classical Japanese traditions, especially Buddhist traditions of reflection, and those of the West. While on the other hand, simultaneously, the Kyoto School explores real moments of difference, incommensurability, and even competition between these various traditions. Nishida, for example, drew on William James's concept of pure experience to great effect, but he also insisted that the Western predilection for beginning with being qua being, being as being itself, set it decisively at odds with the foundations of Eastern thought, foundations that began instead with nothingness rather than being or substance. This line of thought is at the center of the work that we'll be reading for the next throughout this module and the next. That is a work called Religion and Nothingness, an extraordinary, if challenging work penned by Nishida's student Nishitani Keiji, who lived from 1900 right up until 1990. The Kyoto School never founded a formal institution. In Japan, the movement is sometimes known as Nishida philosophy, after its founder. Among the other important figures who belong to the movement, the two most prominent are Nishida's students, Tanabe Hajime, who brought Pure Land traditions into dialogue with a more Hegelian inheritance, and Nishitani Keiji, who we'll be reading. Nishida, in fact, sent both Tanabe and Nishitani to Europe to continue their studies during the interwar period. Tanabe studied with Heidegger from 1922 to 24, and so did Nishitani from 1936 to 39. While modern Western philosophy adopted an increasingly secular and anti-metaphysical stance, Asian philosophy has tended to retain its religious and soteriological orientation. Soteriology has to do with sort of salvation, realization, the end things, that kind of stuff, enlightenment. This is one of the most startling aspects of the Kyoto school for Western readers, for at the very time when dominant philosophical movements like existentialism, positivism, and so forth were seeking to shed their religious orientation, the thinkers of the Kyoto school actively embraced and sought a reintegration of philosophy and religion. Accordingly, the philosophers of the Kyoto school not only take Western philosophy seriously, but they also read deeply in Western theological traditions. At the same time, however, they remain grounded in the philosophical and religious traditions of classical Japanese thought, especially Mahayana Buddhism. Both Nishida and Tanabe brought a deep Buddhist formation to their philosophical work. With Nishitani, however, you find something a little bit different. In his student days, Nishitani had little interest in Japanese culture. He had an ambivalent, unstable relationship to Zen as well, which he was both attracted to but also sometimes repelled by. He was from the start deeply taken with the European philosophical tradition, especially Nietzsche. He's reported to have carried a copy of Thus Spake Zarathustra with him everywhere while he was an undergraduate student, and he was interested as well in the contemporary works of Bergson and Heidegger. He wrote a graduate thesis on Friedrich Schelling and Henri Bergson, and then he taught philosophy in high school before being appointed to Otani University in Kyoto in the late 20s. In 1936, his ambivalence about Zen broke, and he began a deep practice of Zen in his own life, one that would remain central for him throughout the rest of his life. He took up his practice under Master Yamazaki at the Rinzai Zen Shokoku-ji temple in Kyoto, and he discovered that he could finally understand what Nishida had meant by direct experience after his practice of Zen. Nishitani saw his Buddhist practice and his philosophical work as balancing one another, sitting and thinking and sitting, reason and the letting go of reason. These were all bound together in a kind of polar movement, a shuttle between these various aspects or modes of engaging the world. In 1937, the Japanese Ministry of Education awarded Nishitani with the funding to study in Europe, largely at Nishida's urging. And he was supposed to have gone to study with Henri Bergson, but this fell apart because of Bergson's declining health. Nishitani was able to convert his application instead to study with Heidegger. And his time with Heidegger coincided with Heidegger's famous 2-year-long seminar on Nietzsche, who we already mentioned Nishitani was quite a fan of. This was a massive undertaking during an obviously politically fraught time in Germany and in Heidegger's life. The effect of studying with Heidegger during this time was that Nishitani was led to see the limits of both Nietzsche and Heidegger. He saw their failure to escape what he considered to be a kind of nihilism that they nevertheless rightly diagnosed. So he thinks that Heidegger and Nietzsche sort of had developed the proper etiology, the right symptomology of what was wrong with the West, but they were unable to escape it themselves. When Nishitani was invited to lecture at the Nietzsche seminar by Heidegger himself, Nishitani chose to lecture on Nietzsche's Zarathustra and Meister Eckhart, the German medieval mystic. For Nishitani, this opening prompted a turn to Zen that brought him more fully into alignment with the work of Nishida and Tanabe, and that then set the agenda for the rest of his philosophical and spiritual life after his return to Japan. While I'm at it, thinking about the 1930s and this interwar period, or actually by this time the Second World War is underway, let me say a quick word about the Kyoto School and the war. As prominent thinkers in Japan, you would expect the Kyoto School to have been caught up in the war effort, and they often were, but in complex ways that don't permit an easy characterization of their involvement. As you'll see, Nishitani and the others can be fierce critics of the West, and they sought a way beyond the Western dichotomy of capitalist liberal accumulation on the one hand and Marxist collectivism on the other. Such critiques could be used to bolster Japanese imperialism and ethno-nationalism, but they also produced severe critiques of this kind of appropriation of their work. Each in their own way wrestled intellectually with what it meant to be a nation. Japan had only emerged from feudalism less than a century before, and had been caught in a state of war and militarization for nearly 50 of the intervening years. In any case, Nishitani and the others argued that what it meant to be a nation was bound up with internationalism, which set them at odds with the imperial government, but also with the American occupiers after the war. Nishitani found himself in exile for about 5 years, without an academic post, and confronting nihilism again, but now with a developed Zen practice as a means to engage productively with it. It was out of these years of reflection that Religion and Nothingness, the text of Religion and Nothingness, was brought to a maturity. And there is something mature, I think, in the works of the Kyoto school. James Heisig, a leading interpreter of the school, has argued, rightly I think, that the Kyoto school broke new philosophical ground by establishing something that Heisig sees really as a world philosophy. Rather than a parochial tradition, the Kyoto school pioneers a 20th century dialogical philosophy that draws on radically philosophically, linguistically, and culturally diverse sources. Comparative philosophies had been undertaken in the West before, but they presumed a Western norm as the point of comparison, essentially reinscribing the West as the only global reality. This, writes Heisig, is the mold that Nishida, Tanabe, and Nishitani have broken, though the consequences of that rupture have only just begun to affect those engaged in the classical Western philosophy around the world. In other words, the Kyoto school philosophers are not merely doing Japanese philosophy, but neither are they repeating European philosophy. They are pointing to the need for what Raymond Panikar will later call dialogical dialogue, an approach to philosophy that reads radically diverse traditions as interlocutors rather than as outliers or curious objects of study. If we try to identify certain key themes characteristic of the Kyoto school, we might look to the 4 or 5 factors picked out by the editors of Japanese Philosophy, a source book, a major compendium of Japanese approaches to philosophy over the last really hundreds, approaching thousands of years. The editors point out that the Kyoto school philosophers have, in the first place, a deep, if critical, appreciation of the value of both Asian and Western sources for doing philosophy. Far from obvious, this marks the Kyoto philosophers out as quite distinct in early 20th century Japanese philosophy that otherwise tended to import its philosophical texts, themes, and practices from the West. The Kyoto philosophers not only embraced classical Japanese sources, but also rejected the reification of the distinction between East and West, the very divide that comparative philosophy is often presumed to bridge. In the second place, the Kyoto school philosophers are often quite critical of Western conceptions of modernity. In this, they might be compared to some postmodern figures, or to folks like Heidegger and Bergson. Criticism of modernity doesn't necessarily mean rejection of modernity, however. As we will see in Nishitani, for example, the way beyond modernity and modern nihilism is not around, but through. Masao Abe, part of the third generation of the Kyoto school, goes even further, arguing for a post-modernity in which sovereignty shifts from nations to all humankind. This kind of criticism of modernity goes hand in hand with an ecumenism that looks to learn from cultural sources and intellectual traditions beyond those of the West. Now, in the third place, Kyoto school thinkers approach philosophy as an integral practice that includes what we in the West might identify as religious and spiritual aspects. Each of them looked both to Buddhist traditions and to interreligious encounters as sources for creative solutions not only to philosophical, but also to social and cultural problems. In particular, many of the Kyoto school philosophers carried on rich and sustained dialogue with the theological and mystical writings of the Christian tradition. Finally, the Kyoto retrieval of Buddhist ideas centers on the notion of absolute nothingness, so much so that philosophical reflection on nothingness in Japan is almost identified with the Kyoto school as its defining mark. This is evident already in Nishida's work and apparent everywhere in Nishitani, as you'll see in our reading. Now, returning to Nishitani, the movement through Nietzsche, Heidegger, and the nihilism of the existential predicament of the 20th century is not just biographical for Nishitani, even if he encountered it powerfully in his life and through his actual interactions with these very figures. As you'll see in your reading, this movement through nihilism is also the fundamental shape of his philosophical project. In this, he shares a lot with the existentialists. Camus, for instance, opens the myth of Sisyphus with the startling statement that suicide is the only real philosophical question. Why? Well, because the conditions of modernity confront us with the inescapable question of whether life, physical or intellectual, has any meaning. The death of God throws the meaning of the world and the value of thinking into precarity. As Nishitani remembered much later in life, my life as a young man can be described in a single phrase. It was a period absolutely without hope. My life at the time lay entirely in the grips of nihility and despair. My decision then to study philosophy was in fact, melodramatic as it may sound, a matter of life and death. In the little history of my soul, this decision meant a kind of conversion. Nihilism, or relative nihility, as Nishitani often puts it, is the recognition that existence itself and the customs, institutions, and traditions we embrace are all without foundation. They hang groundlessly over the void, distracting us from their meaninglessness. The despair this can create for those who confront it directly is real and horrifying. But there is at the same time a kind of intellectual or soul death that occurs when one turns away from this realization, sheltering in the various lifestyles, politics, and moral stances, all of them indefensible, that you adopt in order to distract yourself from the vertigo of the meaning crisis. We've seen a variety of responses to this predicament already. Heidegger's sense that only a God can save us, Murdoch's turn towards the good beyond being, and Desmond's invocation of a transcendent fullness and primal astonishment as returning us to an encounter with the potencies of being. Nishitani would have appreciated much of this, I think, but his own way out is different. In a word, Nishitani insists that the only way out of nihilism is through it. To do this, we have to first think the problem of nothingness in all of its power and apparent intractability. We'll be reading his most mature version of that thinking through, but he undertakes this project a number of times, especially in his earlier work, The Self-Overcoming of Nihilism, whose title dramatically illustrates its thesis. For Nishitani, the disease of European nihilism is brought on by the rapid collapse of Western metaphysics and the death of God. Nietzsche was the first to recognize this, but Nietzsche didn't cause it. We've been looking at some of the dynamics pushing in this direction throughout this course, especially in our earlier readings. But the result was the collapse of a worldview that had sustained, enlivened, and renewed European thought and culture for nearly 2,000 years. In its place, the masters of suspicion, Feuerbach, Marx, Nietzsche, Freud, and others, taught us to see religion, philosophy, metaphysics, and even ethics as so many forms of human projection. This unleashed a great doubt, one that made Hume and Descartes seem tame by comparison. But their earlier response to skeptical doubts still provided the playbook for 20th century responses to this existential dread. The only way to stand in the face of such bracing currents was to shelter in the self, the subject and his or her desires. Nietzsche too recognized this and named it the will to power, the will to invent new values and to give oneself passionately to them without grounding or justification. The nothingness of existence could be met only by boldly taking the reins of history oneself and bending it to our own projects, values, and creations. This doesn't need to be totalitarian. There's much in Nietzsche that suggests it is far more aesthetic, creative, and affirmative. But for all of that, it's still voluntaristic. It's a choice we make to live in the face of despair. It's a turning to the will. It is also remarkably, and for the very same reason, anthropocentric. Nishitani sees this anthropocentrism as a result of the Christian framework, from which the modern problem of nihilism emerged. If the reductive world of mechanistic materialism is a kind of decapitated Cartesianism, Descartes' world with all the thinking things removed from them, the bracing world of modern nihilism could be seen as the Christian cosmos with God removed, a fallen world centered but a fallen world, but one without hope of grace or redemption. Nietzsche tries to overcome this vision by appealing to something other than God. Finally, by appealing to the great affirmation, as he puts it, and thus spoke Zarathustra, the amor fati, the love of fate, the love of self and world that wills them to be just as they are. This is the revelation that struck Nietzsche like thunder and led to Zarathustra and the later works. By affirming the world and one's own existence, a kind of meaning is salvaged in the face of meaninglessness. Nishitani, however, refers to this as nihility. As he writes, nihility refers to that which renders meaninglessness the meaning of life. But for Nishitani, this isn't the end of religion, but only its beginning. Only when we recognize our own precarity, when we feel the gaping abyss opening upon the very ground on which we stand, an abyss that is always with us, only then are we on the threshold of religion. Nishitani says religion is, quote, the real self-awareness of reality. Religion plays a big role in the chapters I'm asking you to read for this week. The very first is entitled, What is Religion? And the title might make you think that Nishitani is going to produce a set of criteria by which religion might be defined, rather as Robert Bellah or Clifford Geertz might do. He certainly doesn't want to know what function religion plays for society. He doesn't want a functional account of religion. As he says, a religion concerned primarily with its own utility bears witness to its degeneration. Nishitani is interested not in a functionalist or even a criteriological definition of religion, but instead in an existential one. He wants to discover what he calls the home ground of religion, which is to say, the religious as dynamically lived in actual life. Religion as lived by real human beings. Religion as emerging from a real subject, a self living in the present, as he puts it. Nishitani is not so much after a descriptive account of what people have called religion, as he is seeking a normative account of what religion should be, what religion could still be, even on this side of modernity and modern nihilism. The argument is complex, and I won't reconstruct it all for you here. I want you to read it. We can talk about it together in the discussion. But one of the fundamental moves he makes in this opening chapter is to argue that we have to shift from the relative field of nihility to the absolute field of what the Buddhists call Śūnyatā, the field of absolute emptiness beyond subjectivity and objectivity. Nietzsche himself came close to this. If you stare long enough into the abyss, it begins to stare back at you. But Nietzsche couldn't tarry with it long enough, Nishitani thinks. He didn't go deep enough. For that, you need something more. You need thinking, yes, but also sitting in the Zen sense. Nishitani's work isn't a work of apologetics. He's not trying to produce a defense of Buddhism, but is rather trying to think the fundamental metaphysical and philosophical problems that are raised by deep Buddhist practice. If it's not an apologetic work, neither is it polemical. He is a generous, if sometimes idiosyncratic, reader of Western philosophy and theology, and he's extraordinarily well-read. I mean, it's just astonishing learning. But he finally critiques Christianity and Judaism for remaining on the pre-nihilistic side of things. For this reason, they haven't been able to mount a defense or a genuinely constructive response to the challenge, the penultimate, the sort of final challenge of modern nihilism. The question of religion becomes salient for us when we're confronted by the collapse of meaning and utility, when we encounter death, for example, the collapse of our hopes and dreams, the onslaught of war, famine, poverty, and so forth. These threaten, quote, the root hold of our existence and bring the meaning of life into question. How do these moments become doors to religion for Nishitani? Well, their power lies in the fact that they take us out of our self-centered preoccupations. They confront us with the kind of selfing that Iris Murdoch describes, and the de-selfing that Iris Murdoch describes, and they force us to face the question of meaning and of meaninglessness by pulling us out of the objectification of ourselves and its desires. Religion presents us instead with the possibility of a genuinely loving and knowing, the possibility of genuinely loving and knowing something, rather than other than just ourselves. A phenomenon that Nishitani compares to the Christian experience of love of neighbor. So he's narrating the difference from the sort of fat, relentless ego that, as Murdoch describes it, to the possibility of a kind of agapeic love, to use Desmond's language. The real self-awareness of reality, that is, religion, should be read in two ways. As an objective genitive, that is, the real self-awareness of reality. It's our awareness of what is really real. As a subjective genitive, however, it is the self-awareness of reality realizing itself in us, which is to say, the self-awareness of reality in our awareness. In this realization, we are, as it were, appropriated by reality. Our ordinary mode of seeing things, however, is one caught within the field of self. In this ordinary way of seeing, we see all things as objects, things related to us and to our desires. Think of Husserl's structure of intentionality, a subject intending an object. Nishitani regularly points to the paradoxes unleashed by this way of viewing things from within the standpoint of the self. We see things as objects indexed to us, but in seeing them as we are, we see neither them nor ourselves, finally. We're distanced both from things and our own true self. The ego is the self caught in itself, the self in the state of attachment to self, which finally demonstrates its own instability. The ego self is a fiction, a delusion. Recognizing this can bring us beyond Cartesian doubt, still rooted in the self, to what Nishitani calls the great doubt, with a capital G and a capital D, the great doubt that is the initiatory portal to real religion. Like Desmond's hyperbolic transcendence, the nihility one encounters here is on the far side of everything that we experience psychologically, but it's on the near side of the subject. It is simultaneously transcendent and immanent. The great doubt is, quote, fundamental uncertainty about the very existence of oneself and others. The great doubt forces us to confront the experience of nihility, not only in our lives, autobiographically, understood, but also in the ground of the world itself, ontologically understood. Existence itself rests upon this nihility, but this doesn't dissolve the world. It nullifies the world, forcing us to see both the fleetingness and the diaphaneity of existence. Emptiness is form, form is emptiness. Nishitani reads this movement through a series of engagements with both Christian theology and atheistic existentialism, but the general movement is one of coming to recognize one's identity beyond selfhood with all things on the field of Śūnyatā. This is as much an impersonal realization as a transpersonal one. For Nishitani, a distinction that will become more important in Chapter 2 on the personal and the impersonal, and in the study of emptiness in Chapters 3 and 4. I've spoken of the field of Śūnyatā, and so to close, let me draw attention to Nishitani's three fields of consciousness, which it may be helpful to keep in mind as you read. The first is the field of consciousness, of ordinary experience, in which we know ourselves as subjects in a world of objects. You go to class, you read books, you prepare breakfast, enjoy the sort of blooming of flowers and leaves as the spring comes. You tend to your garden, you go to meetings, and so forth. But ordinary experience can be disrupted by events, or even disruptive by the iterative banality of the ordinary. Life can lose meaning when tragedy strikes. A pandemic locks you in your home. Someone you know suddenly dies. An invading force enters your country. Political ruptures are happening all around you, and everything's thrown into precarity. You receive a diagnosis you hadn't expected. In these cases, color can seem to fade to gray. This is the field of nihilism, where the meaning of things is evacuated. It can also happen through sheer repetition, as when you repeat a word over and over and over and over again, and it becomes something angular, jarring, meaningless. Camus memorably records this in the opening of The Myth of Sisyphus. It happens, he writes, that the stage sets collapse. Rising, streetcar, 4 hours in the office or the factory, meal, streetcar, 4 hours of work, meal, sleep, and Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, according to the same rhythm. This path is easily followed most of the time, but one day the why arises, and everything begins in that weariness tinged with amazement. But this is not yet for Nishitani the final field. The escape from nihilism can't be Camus' absurdist path of subjective courage in the face of a meaningless universe. It is only found by passing to a third level, the field of Śūnyatā, of absolute emptiness. Śūnyatā represents the endpoint of an orientation to negation, writes Nishitani. It can be termed an absolute negativity inasmuch as it is a standpoint that has negated and thereby transcended nihility, which was itself the transcendence through negation of all being. It can also be termed an absolute transcendence of being, as it absolutely denies and distances itself from any standpoint shackled in any way whatsoever to being. In this sense, emptiness can be described as outside of and absolutely other than the standpoint shackled to being, provided we avoid the misconception that emptiness is something distinct from being and subsisting outside it. In spite of its transcendence of the standpoint shackled to being, or rather because of it, emptiness can only appear as a self-identity with being, by which both being and emptiness are seen as co-present from the start and structurally inseparable from one another. Hence, talk of transcendence does not entail withdrawing off to some transcendent thing called emptiness or nothingness. Emptiness lies on the near side more so than what we normally regard as our own self. Emptiness or nothingness is not something we can turn to. It is not something out there in front of us. It defies objective representation. No sooner do we assume such an attitude toward it than emptiness withdraws into hiding. Emptiness, in other words, is that through which we experience the being of everything, rather than some experience in the midst of other experiences. Throughout the 4 chapters I'm asking you to read from this remarkable book, Nishitani will take that insight, and he'll turn it over and over again and again. And through it, he'll engage many of the foundational concepts, texts, and traditions of the West, seeing them thereby in a new light. But in some ways, Nishitani's text functions as a kind of koan to the Western mind, posing questions that are not so much to be answered as they are to be lived through, and through which we ourselves are to be transformed. So, by way of wrapping this up, let me leave you with one of my favorite of the koans from the Zen tradition. The most famous one is the question, what is the sound of one hand clapping? But actually the one hand motif gets developed in lots of Zen koans, a whole series of them. One of my favorites sees the master ask, what if the one hand is cut by the sumo sword? And the student is supposed to answer, it can't be, or if it can, let me see you do it. And so saying, the student extends his hand forward. Or, without saying a thing, after the master says, what if the one hand is to be cut by the sumo sword, the student simply puts his hand out. There's another moment, one hand koan, where the master says, why can't it cut the one hand? That is, why can't the sumo sword cut the one hand? And the answer is that the student is to give is because the one hand pervades the universe. The master says, then show me something that contains the universe. And the student simply puts out the one hand. Now, I'm not going to try to unpack those for you, and I'm not in any place to try to do so in my own personal and spiritual life. I just find them intriguing, fascinating, resonant with some of what Nishitani is doing in this work. Instead of extending the one hand to us in a koan, he's extending a text philosophically, but I think it functions like that and may have the opportunity for us to discover deeper and deeper layers in it as we meditate on it and wrestle with it, both in thought and in sitting. I invite you to do so, and I look forward to our conversations in the discussion. Thanks for your time.